Hey everyone, this is graphic designer Roberto Blake, and today I'm actually going to talk to you about what computers you can use as a graphic designer. Now this video actually is because someone actually requested in the comments on a previous video that I did on how you get more design clients, and they wanted to know what type of computer they should actually use for graphic design because they were looking at an upgrade. Primarily they were trying to decide between an iMac as a desktop or whether they should get a laptop, and which one, if any, would be best for them doing Photoshop and graphic design work. Now if you're watching this video, you can obviously see that I have an iMac that I use as my desktop. Although I've used Windows desktops in the past, I'm actually still in the process of building my ultimate Photoshop PC, which you can read about in an article on my blog on robertoblake.com/blog. If you've actually looked at my blog before, you also know that I make some recommendations as to how I go about choosing a Mac laptop or a PC laptop when you're trying to get into graphic design or Photoshop. So today I'm going to cover a couple of brief points that I already mentioned in those previous articles. First off, I'm going to just quickly address using a desktop versus a laptop. The short answer is that you probably want both. At one point or the other, you're going to need both, and here's why. In terms of doing more intense work with regard to print especially, you're going to want a desktop because you can actually have a higher level of RAM and faster hard drives, multiple hard drives, built-in graphics cards, etc. in a desktop such as an iMac or any other desktop computer that you're going to use. Preferably, if you're doing higher end print work, I would recommend 4 to 8 gigs of RAM as your minimum starting place, and go up to as much as 16 or 32 if you're going to be doing that, motion graphics, or video editing. Now, if you've been watching my videos, I just want to point out that I do my video production and editing on this iMac, which is the base model with 4 gigs of RAM, and this is the mid-2010 model. So this has 4 gigs of RAM, half a gig of dedicated video, and dual-core i3 processors. Now, when I'm doing my Windows Photoshop tutorials, I'm actually using my Asus laptop, which has 8 gigs of RAM, shared video memory, and dual-core processors running at about 2.2 gigahertz each. Primary difference between this and that are the hard drive speeds. Although for Photoshop work, that's kind of hit or miss. Ideally, you want multiple hard drives and you want a speed of 7,200 RPMs. The big difference between these is the hard drive speed, and that's actually the only real shortcoming that my Asus laptop has. But that laptop actually cost me about less than $400 after I upgraded the RAM, and it actually competes with a Mac Pro in terms of performance. It competes with the i5 MacBook Pro, believe it or not. Now again, the 8 gigs of RAM makes a difference because the standard on that laptop, as far as the MacBook Pro, is 4 gigs, and if you can upgrade it, which you actually can only technically upgrade the MacBook Pro to 6 gigs, and if you do it yourself, you void the warranty. That's part of the issue. So in terms of choosing a laptop, when you're choosing a laptop, you want to look at the following things. You want it to have over 2 gigahertz of speed or better. You want a minimal of dual core, but quad core is probably for the best. If you can get an i5 or i7 processor or better, great. If you can't, at least make sure you're getting a Pentium B or a Core Duo processor. In terms of hard drive, most of your laptops are going to have a standard 5400 RPM speed hard drive. If you can get a laptop that has an SSD drive and a hard drive, that's probably for the best because you can use the SSD drive, or at least part of it, as a scratch disk for Photoshop. And as you know, if you've read any of my previous blogs on that subject, scratch disk for Photoshop caching will speed up your performance in Photoshop dramatically when going to an external hard drive or a secondary hard drive, whether it be in a laptop or a desktop. If you don't have a secondary hard drive in your machine, whether it's a laptop or a desktop, you can use an external USB hard drive as a scratch disk, and that will actually increase your Photoshop performance dramatically. It's something that I recommend and that I actually do with the iMac. If you're going to work on a machine like an iMac, I recommend using the OWC upgrade kit for the RAM and going to an additional 8 gigs, which will take you to 12, or getting the outright 16 gig upgrade, which if you're on a 2010 or earlier iMac, That's the maximum you can go to. If you're on 2011 through current iMac, you can go up to 32 gigs of RAM, although 16 gigs is the recommended maximum amount. But you can legitimately go to 32 and it'll still work. It shouldn't have any problems. After the RAM upgrade, what you'll want to do is you'll want to utilize an external USB hard drive so that you can use it as a scratch disk. This is especially helpful if you're doing very intense Photoshop work with multiple layers, or if you're using filters, liquify, anything like that. If you're doing video editing, you should do the same thing in Premiere Pro if that's what you're using, and After Effects. Going back to laptops. If you don't want to go the cheap route, which still works really well for me on the Asus side, you could get either an HP or a Samsung notebook, or you can get a higher end Asus notebook. You can get them with comparable or superior specs to your standard MacBook Pro, which starts out at about $1299, I believe, for a 13-inch, $1499 for a 15 non-Retina. You can get something comparable in an HP, Samsung, or Asus for $800 to $900 or less. Usually if you go with the HP, Samsung, or Asus and you're trying to get comparable specs to the MacBook Pro, what you'll end up getting is either i5 or i7 dual to quad core processors that max out at about 3 gigahertz each, which is great as far as your processing power for applications like Photoshop, Premiere, and After Effects. The other great thing about these is they come with a dedicated video card that usually has about 1 gig, and it's usually an NVIDIA. Both the iMac and the MacBook Pro usually come with about half a gig of dedicated video. Some of them you can upgrade and have the higher end model of that, but this comes standard at $300 less on your competing models in the PC market. So that's why I recommend those in terms of keeping your costs down. And in terms of a Mac versus a PC, your performance is going to come down to your specs. Having a Mac versus a PC does not affect your performance in the Adobe applications. If you don't believe me, there's a white paper on this that Adobe publishes. You can just Google Adobe Hardware Performance White Paper, and they'll explain why, as long as you're in a 64-bit operating system, it doesn't matter if you're on a Mac or PC. It all comes down to specs at that point. Now, in terms of user interface and productivity, that's something that's up for debate. In truth, you can actually install a theme on Windows that will actually give you the same user interface and user experience of a Mac on a PC. You can also go the quote-unquote Hackintosh route if you're on a desktop and build a desktop that's running Mac OS and build out all your components yourself and have that machine at a cheaper cost and have the ability to pick out your own components custom for yourself and what you want them to be, buy them over time, etc., which will probably cost you about half of buying a Mac Pro Tower or the new Mac Pro once it comes out, that's the cylinder. So again, to prioritize what you should be looking for in a graphic design or Photoshop machine: fast hard drives, SSDs if you can get them. Minimum of 4 gigs of RAM, preferably 8. Honestly, a maximum of 32 if you can get it. In terms of a desktop, all-in-one, if you go the all-in-one route, iMacs like what I have are great if you want to go the all-in-one route. However, you can get Samsung and HP all-in-one desktops that are comparable to an iMac or better and have touchscreen capabilities at about $300 to $400 less. In terms of desktops, Windows desktops are going to be cheaper than Mac Pros. I have a Mac Pro G5 tower sitting out in the living room. That thing is actually very expensive. I inherited mine, so I didn't have to deal with that part of it, but I've been able to build superior machines to that at a much lower cost, usually half or less the cost, and having double the power. Laptops, make sure that you're getting USB 3.0 for your connections. Make sure that you're getting dedicated video inside of that laptop so you can take advantage of the new Mercury playback engine in the Adobe products and OpenGL. Make sure that you're getting 4 to 8 gigs of RAM inside of that laptop, and if you can, make sure you have multiple drives or SSDs, or that you're using an external drive for your caching space. Well, I hope this helps you guys know what laptops and what desktops you should be looking at when you're going to do Photoshop or graphic design work in general. If you're a web designer, it honestly almost doesn't matter what you use, and you can actually go the cheap route with no real repercussions, because you're going to be mostly working in either a very light visual editor. You might be using Photoshop Elements, you might be using Fireworks, you might be using GIMP, you might be using Pixelmator or something else like that. And as far as your applications, you'll be using Aptana, Notepad++, Composer, or Dreamweaver. Those aren't resource intensive at all, so it really doesn't matter if you're going to be a web designer, what machine you're on, as long as you have some things that help you out like WAMP, XAMP, etc. So again, not very labor intensive in terms of resources and processor to do programming unless you're doing compiling. Then you need a lot of processing power and RAM. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like it if you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe, share it with others, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Don't forget, Photoshop CC tutorials every Thursday. If you're watching it this week, this week's tutorial is actually going to be on sharpening, so stay tuned for that.